This instructional video is on rotations. When learning about rotations, we first need to identify how many degrees are we turning. The first set, 90 degrees, means that we will turn the shape one time, or you can think about it as one section, one quadrant. If the directions say 180 degrees, that represents turning the shape two times or two sections. 270 degrees means that we are rotating the shape three times or three sections. And if the directions say 360 degrees, that is four times or a complete circle. And it means that we have started back at the beginning. Not only do we have to know how many degrees we are turning, but we also have to know what direction. The first direction that we can turn is clockwise. When looking at a coordinate plane, we have quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. And a clockwise direction goes around the coordinate plane just like a clock. It would start up at 12 o'clock, go to 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and back to 12. It goes around the clock. The opposite direction is called counterclockwise. Counterclockwise means when we have a coordinate plane and we have the quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4, we go the opposite direction. So we start at midnight and we go the opposite direction 9, 6, 3, and back to 12. Number 1, rotate 90 degrees clockwise about the origin. In order to rotate a shape, we're going to start by taking our patty paper, lining our patty paper up at the origin with the edges of the paper matching the X and the Y axis. And then we will copy the points onto the patty paper. Once we have the shape completely copied, we will then identify the next location. For the directions, it says rotate 90 degrees, which means one time. Clockwise goes around the coordinate plane towards the left. So our shape, which is currently in quadrant 4, will rotate to quadrant number 3. So we're going to take our patty paper, we're going to put it in quadrant 3, placing the corner at the 0 origin, lining up the X and the Y axis with the edges of the paper, and then plotting the new points. You should see that the S point still lines up at the origin 0, making that S prime. Point T now lines up at 3, -2, making that T prime. R lines up at 2, -3, making that R prime. And point U still lines up at -4, -4, making that U prime. Connecting our dots to make the same diamond, but you can tell that it is not in the same direction. For number 2, again, we're going to start by taking our patty paper, lining the corner up at the origin 0, and the edges of the paper line up with the X and the Y axis, and then we trace our shape onto the patty paper. Once we have all of the points and the shape completely copied, we can then identify our next section. 270 degrees means that we are going to rotate 3 times, and clockwise means we go towards the left. So starting in quadrant 1, we would count 1, 2, 3 sections, making our shape end in quadrant 2. We line up our corner of our patty paper up at the origin 0. We line up the edges of the paper with the X and the Y axis, and then we can graph the points. Point A, which started at 3, 1, now ends up at -1, 3. Point B is still at 1, 1. And point C is now at 4, 1. Connecting your dots, you can see that the triangle is still the same size and the same shape, but you can see that it is now turned sideways. Number 3, we're going to rotate the rectangle 180 degrees counterclockwise about the origin. Start by taking your patty paper, lining the corner up at the 0 origin and the edges of the patty paper with the X and the Y axis. And we can go ahead and copy the points onto the patty paper. The 180 degrees tells us that we're going to rotate 2 times, and counterclockwise tells us to go backwards or towards the right-hand side. So when we rotate sections, we would count 1, 2, meaning we're going to end up in quadrant number 4. Point A would be located at +2, -1. Point B is located at +3, -1. Point C is located at +3, -4. And point D is located at +2, -4. We can connect our dots to make the same rectangle, but you can see that it has been turned and flipped upside down. Number 4, we're rotating this shape 90 degrees counterclockwise about the origin. We start by taking our patty paper, lining it up at the 0 origin in the corner, making sure the edges of our patty paper match up with the X and the Y axis, and then we can trace the original shape. To go 90 degrees means we are going to rotate 1 time. Counterclockwise means we go backwards to the right-hand side around the coordinate plane. So our shape goes from quadrant 2 to quadrant 3. We take our patty paper, lining up the corner at the 0 origin and lining up the edges with the X and the Y axis. Point R becomes located at -1, -2. S is still at -3, -3. U is now at 1, -5. And T is now at 3, -5. Connecting our dots, you can see that the quadrilateral is still the same size and shape, but that it has turned sideways. Number 5, rotate 360 degrees clockwise about the origin. The number 360 degrees means 4 times. Clockwise tells us to go to the left around the coordinate plane. So we would take our shape and count 1, 2, 3, 4 sections, and you notice we end up back where we started. This shape does not change positions when we go all the way around the coordinate plane. All the way in a circle, 360 degrees, means our points start back where they end up. Number 6, rotate 270 degrees counterclockwise about the origin. We start by putting our corner of our patty paper at the origin 0, lining up the edges of the patty paper with the X and the Y axis. We can then trace the points onto the patty paper itself. 270 degrees means that we're going to rotate 3 times. Counterclockwise means we're going to go to the right, backwards around the coordinate plane. And so our shape goes from quadrant 3 to 1, 2, 3 times, finishing up in quadrant number 2. To graph our points, we line up our patty paper corner at 0 origin, matching up the edges of the patty paper with the X and the Y axis. Point A is now located at -3, +1. Point D is located at -2, +2. Point C is located at -2, +3. And point B is located at -3, +5. We connect our dots. It is the same trapezoid, but we can tell that the trapezoid has been turned sideways. For number 1, we want to identify how many degrees the shape has been turned and in what direction. So starting with the original shape, which is on the bottom, and going to the top shape, we can say that it goes 1 time which would be a 90-degree rotation, and then that direction would be clockwise. However, you could also go the other direction and count 1, 2, 3 sections, which would represent a 270-degree rotation counterclockwise. All rotations have two possible interpretations depending on whether you go clockwise or counterclockwise. For right now, you need to represent both correct answers because you need to be able to identify both correct answers on future assignments. For number 2, we are taking the original trapezoid, which is the top, and going to the new trapezoid on the bottom, counting 1, 2 sections. 2 sections is 180 degrees. And we would label that one as a counterclockwise rotation. However, we can also go the other direction, counting 1, 2 times. That is also a 180-degree rotation, and that direction would be clockwise. Number 3, taking our triangle on the left and rotating it to the triangle on the right, we can go 1 section, which would represent a 90-degree rotation. The 1 section to the right is a counterclockwise direction. Or we can count 1, 2, 3 sections if we go the other direction. 3 sections is represented by a 270-degree rotation, and that one would be clockwise. In number 4, taking the bottom quadrilateral and rotating it to the top quadrilateral, we can go either direction. If we go 1 section over, 1 section is represented by a 90-degree rotation, and that direction would be counterclockwise. If we go the other direction, it would be 1, 2, 3 times. 3 times is 270-degree rotation, and that direction is clockwise. In number 5, taking the rectangle on the right-hand side on top and rotating it to the bottom rectangle, it counts 2 sections. 2 sections is a 180-degree rotation. The direction I went first is clockwise, but we also know we can go the other direction and count 1, 2 sections as well. So it is also a 180 degrees counterclockwise rotation. Number 6, when dealing with a shape that overlaps or spans 2 different quadrants, we want to focus on 1 point at a time. So if I look at my original point X and I want to go to the new point X, I could go 1 section over, which would represent a 90-degree rotation, and that direction is clockwise. However, I could also go the other direction and I could count 1, 2, 3 sections, meaning I would go 270-degree rotation, and that would be a counterclockwise rotation.